Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate y'all coming out and setting aside the time to do so. My name is Trevor, and I'm a teaching assistant here at Launch School. And today is sort of a special webinar because it's actually a sequel to the study tips workshop that I've hosted a whole bunch of times now. Some of you have actually been to that one. I hosted that maybe a month or two ago. But that means that this talk has brand new content and a totally different structure from that original study tips workshop. So that said, I did design this to be like a standalone talk. So don't worry if you haven't seen the first one. This should still be easy for you to follow along with and full of actionable tips and tools that you can go ahead and take with you. Now, as you might know, at the end of each one of these workshops, we ask participants to fill out a feedback form. And we honestly do sit and read every one of those responses so that we can kind of tweak and improve on each iteration of these workshops. And with my first study tips workshop, I focused primarily on like my own study habits and things that have worked really well for me as an individual. And I think because of that, I received two pieces of feedback that I found really valuable. First, a couple of participants pointed out that it would be nice to see someone else's study practices so that they could sort of like compare and contrast them to my own. And then additionally, a few people said it would be even better if I focused a bit more on the scientific research surrounding studying and learning rather than just drawing exclusively from my own experiences. And really, those two comments were the impetus for this particular webinar, which I hope is able to fill in some of the gaps from my original study tips talk. So with all that said, let's take a look at what's on the agenda for today. First, we're going to do a quick review of my personal study methods, just to sort of provide some context for the rest of the talk. Then we're going to look at my fellow TA Claire's approach to studying so that we can compare and contrast that to my own. After that, I'm going to give a quick run through of some of the scientific research surrounding learning and memory to see if there are any trends that we can identify. And then that's going to lead us into a discussion of something called the Neuroplasticity Super Protocol, which is an attempt by the Stanford neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman to synthesize the last 50 years of neuroplasticity research into a series of actionable tools for faster and deeper learning. That section of the talk is pretty cool, pretty popular. And then finally, because that is going to be just an absolute barrage of information, I'm going to do my best to sum things up by extracting what I think are the biggest and maybe the most important takeaways from the whole talk, and then close with what I hope is some useful perspective on this whole sort of like learning, studying conversation. So as you can probably guess, we have a ton of content to get to. But before we start, we do have a little bit of housekeeping to take care of. First, if you scroll down or up to your Zoom toolbar, you should be able to see the Q&A button that you can use to ask me questions during the talk. So if at any point I say something confusing or unclear and you need me to clarify, feel free to use that function to communicate with me sort of in real time. I don't want anybody to get lost or left behind, so if that's happening, you can always reach out to me there. That said, please realize that anytime you submit a question, I get a notification which essentially stops me from saying what I'm saying. So if you have sort of like general questions or comments or things you think you can think that can wait, I ask that you please just save those for the Q&A section at the end of the workshop. I promise I will stick around to answer every single question to the best of my abilities. So don't worry that we're going to like run out of time and you're not going to be able to ask me something or something like that. I'm going to stick around and try my best to answer everybody's questions. Additionally, if this is your first time attending one of these webinars, you should know that all audience members are muted and have their cameras turned off by default. So that means I can't see you, I can't hear you, and neither can anybody else. So you don't need to have any of that latent anxiety about being seen or anything like that. And then finally, before we dive into today's content, I should just point out, I don't have any slides to share with you or any notes or anything like that. And so if you find one of my slides particularly information dense or useful, a good tactic you can use is just to snap a screenshot of that. And then at the end, if you want to say, hey, I kind of missed one of those, could you scroll back and let me take a screenshot? I can do that for you. Okay. All right. Whew. So let's get into it. So, like I said earlier, in my first study tips workshop, I laid out the approach to studying that allowed me to be relatively successful at launch school, and essentially here's what that looks like. During nearly every study session, I utilize something known as the Pomodoro Technique, which is essentially just a time management technique where you divide a task into 25-minute long chunks, followed by like a 5-minute or shorter break. And typically you perform a block of 4 of these chunks followed by a longer break of some kind. And the primary benefit of this method is that it allows you to exert a really high degree of focus on the task at hand because the duration of each chunk is relatively short. Breaks come at a high enough interval or high enough frequency that you're able to accumulate a really large amount of intensely focused work without excessive fatigue or distraction setting in. And then in general, I would set a weekly goal for the number of blocks I'd perform, which again consists of a total of about 100 minutes of work and maybe like 10 to 20 minutes of rest. And to the extent possible, I would try not to focus on any outcome-oriented goals like completing a course at a specific date or doing anything like that. I really would just worry about accumulating my blocks of focused studying. And then during those study blocks, the approach that I took is actually super simple. I typically took 3 total passes through the material. And before I detail exactly how I organize my studies, let's just review the overall structure of the launch school curriculum so that we're all on the same page here. That's what that little white block is up in the corner there. So as you can see, we have something like a course that might be like RB 101 or whatever. And that's going to be divided up into multiple lessons, lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, etc. And then each lesson actually consists of multiple assignments and culminates in a quiz that covers the material in that lesson. Okay. Lesson 1, assignment 2, assignment 3, and then a quiz. And then at the end of that course, so at the end of RB 101, there's going to be a study guide and then a test covering all of the material from all of the lessons and assignments in that course. Okay. So here's what I actually do when I would study now. First, I'd go through a lesson once to gain sort of like a lay of the land. And this is just a cursory reading of the material to gain a basic level of exposure. I wouldn't take any notes. And, because of that, when I took that quiz for the first time, I would usually do pretty terribly. And then I go through the entire lesson again with the intention of actually mastering the material this time. And on my second pass, I would sort of mentally divide things up by assignment rather than by dealing with that whole lesson 1. So first I would read that assignment, and then I would write a long form summary in my own words of the content in that assignment, including my own coding examples and my own analogies. And once I do that for every assignment in a lesson, I take that quiz again, and lo and behold, I usually do way better that time. And once I've done that for every lesson in the course, I would go through the launch school provided study guide and I'd answer the questions, just sort of like long form in writing. I'd also ensure to answer any remaining practice problems that I have or revisit any of the practice problems that I had trouble with on my first or my second pass through the material. And then I'd finish by doing a third pass through all the course material. Basically, like I would just tackle the entire course because I'm trying to ensure that I didn't learn anything new or come across anything that I didn't understand. So I would essentially sit there and read all of the course material again, RB 101, start to finish. Along the way, I would test my understanding by performing a third attempt at each one of those quizzes. And again, my goal here with this sort of like review portion is just to refresh my memory a little bit on some of those earlier topics because it's been a little while since I've looked at them. But mostly, I'm just ensuring that there's nothing that I missed, which means that I really shouldn't learn anything new during this phase. And then finally, prior to the exam, I would go through my own summaries and my own answers to the study guide questions, just to make sure that like my personal individual explanations of the concepts are fresh in my mind as I go into that exam. And so that's really it. Like my approach was pretty simple. I didn't rely on a lot of fancy tools or techniques. I would just rely on focused, like intense focus with sort of like intermittent breaks, repetition, and then long form summaries of the material, as well as like all of the provided exercises, the quizzes, and the study guides that I'd use to like test and reinforce my understanding. Okay, and so here, as a point of contrast, my fellow TA, Claire, actually does things fairly differently. She also takes an iterative approach where she goes through the material multiple different times, but the way she structures her sessions, the way that she breaks things up, and the tools that she uses vary pretty substantially from my own approach. And so instead of taking 3 separate passes through the material, she follows a series of steps for each individual assignment in a course, just like one after another. She doesn't use a timer or follow any strict rules about how long to study or when she should take breaks. She follows a much more like organic structure and just takes a break when each one of those study steps is complete. And then after completing each step for each assignment, she moves into exam prep mode. Okay, so let's kind of zoom in on that a little bit. Like I said, Claire breaks things up assignment by assignment and applies the following steps to each one just in a row. First, she simply reads the assignment while taking some notes. And on this first pass through the assignment, her notes are like pretty sparse, and she just aims to document the main idea of the assignment or kind of note anything that she found sort of surprising or particularly interesting. And then after that, she goes and she takes a break. And again, she's not like running a clock or anything like that, like I do. She just takes a breather after she does that first pass through the first assignment. And then when she comes back from a break, it's time for step 2, where she tries to write down everything that she remembers about that first assignment. She then spends some time comparing this with those initial sparse notes that she took. And then after that, it's time for another quick break. And then when she comes back from this second break, she makes some flashcards of the material from memory still. So she's only read the material once, remember? And then she compares those flashcards with her notes to ensure that they're all accurate, right? She doesn't want to write anything down wrong. And then once that's done, she takes a second pass through that same assignment, so second time reading the assignment, while updating and expanding upon her notes and her flashcards. And then after that second pass, she's ready to just move on to the next assignment, and she starts that whole process over again. And then when she finishes all of the assignments in a lesson, she takes that quiz at the end of the lesson and then moves right ahead to the first assignment in the next lesson and just repeats the process over again. And that's basically how things look for her until she finishes the course and starts reviewing for the exam. At that point, she uses the provided quizzes, the study guide, and the lesson summaries to create a mock exam, which she also creates a crib sheet for, sort of a cheat sheet. She then practices taking her mock exam while using her little crib sheet or cheat sheet. Okay, so 2 different approaches. There was a lot of detail there, so let's sort of zoom in on some of the difference, the similarities and the differences between the 2. So we'll talk about the similarities first. First, it was relevant to me, or obvious to me, that we both took multiple exposures to the material, or we had that multiple exposures to the material built into our study approach. Neither one of us could sit down, read it once, and understand it. Claire reads it twice. I would read it 3 times. Neither one of us only read it once. We both had like intermittent breaks sort of built into our study sessions. They weren't an afterthought. They were like a part of how we did things. We both had some sort of technique where we would practice explaining things in our own words. So we wouldn't just consume the material. We would actually try to digest it a little bit and then sort of put it back out in our own words. But there were some really relevant differences, I thought. So first, my study sessions were like super structured, while Claire's are way looser and more organic. Like I literally have a timer running that tells me when to break, when to get back to work, when to take a longer break. And Claire didn't. She just sort of went through her steps, and when it was time for a break, she took a break. Claire's approach is more linear, while mine is more iterative. So this is a little conceptual. But if you remember, I would go through like a whole lesson, and then I would go in and I'd look at each assignment, and then I would go and I'd look at the whole course as a big chunk, where Claire would basically just go assignment, assignment, next assignment, next assignment, next assignment, next assignment. And so she would have a more iterative approach. Claire takes notes and uses flashcards while I write summaries and would reread the material. So the actual techniques that we used were actually pretty different. And then Claire's exam prep involved this like mock exam, which I didn't do any of that. And mine involved just like answering the questions on the study guide in long form, in writing, and just reviewing all of the notes I've already taken and the summaries I've already taken. Very different approach for exam prep. Okay, so while I do think there's something useful about seeing these 2 different approaches and kind of thinking about them, we are just 2 people out of many people. I don't know how many, what is it, 8 billion people or something, and we're 2 of them. So it's hard to make a generalization out of that small of a sample size, N of 2. So, you might be asking, what does the research actually have to say about all of this? And what I found when I started really looking into learning and studying is that there's a ton of research looking at like almost every aspect of studying you could imagine. Like I'm talking about all the way from like how much time you should spend studying in a particular day to like whether or not flashcards are actually helpful for learning specific topics. Big, broad range of stuff there. And so in order to make sense of all of this, I'm just going to divide things into two really broad categories, which I'm calling like organizational factors that influence learning outcomes. Like literally, how do you organize your studying throughout the day and the week? And then specific tactics that have been shown to be more or less useful. And when it comes down to organizing your studying, three factors showed up as being the most important, like over and over again in all of the research that I read. And those three things are spaced repetition, interleaving of topics, and regular breaks. Okay, so when we're talking about spaced repetition, we're really looking at how you distribute a fixed amount of study time across a day, a week, a month, or a year. And now the research is really clear that distributing your available study time over shorter, more frequent sessions is more beneficial than longer, less frequent study sessions. So in fact, here's a quote from the conclusion of a meta-analysis that looked at like 184 different studies that investigated this particular topic. Quote, more than 100 years of distributed practice research have demonstrated that learning is powerfully affected by the temporal distribution of study time. More specifically, spaced versus massed learning of items consistently shows benefits regardless of retention interval. And that term retention interval just means like regardless of how much later you're tested on the thing. Doesn't seem to matter. Spaced repetition wins. And so practically what this means is that if you have, let's say 15 hours each week that you can dedicate to studying, it will very likely be more beneficial for you to divide that into 3 5-hour-long sessions as opposed to 5 3-hour-long sessions, or even more so, 2 7.5-hour-long sessions. So shorter, more frequent sessions to the extent that that's possible. It's a better way to organize things. Okay, this next really important structural or organization component looks at which topics you should focus on during each individual study session. And it turns out that interleaving, weird word, is a really beneficial practice in that regard. So this term interleaving essentially just means structuring your studies so that you sort of mix or interleave multiple topics into an individual study session. So it can be thought of as an alternative to like block studying, whereby you dedicate long chunks of time to one topic and then you move on to the next. Interleaving seems to be particularly beneficial when you're dealing with related topics or concepts, as it can help you draw distinctions and connections between them. So here's a quote from a systematic review looking at the research on interleaving. Quote, in conclusion, the findings of this systematic review show that interleaving, when applied appropriately, can be a powerful tool for learning new concepts. It can boost both memory and transfer and applies across different subject domains. Great. Its benefits stem from helping learners to contrast similar items that would otherwise be easily confused. And as such, it should be applied where teachers believe common misconceptions lie. So in practical terms for us, I think what this means is that if you're trying to decide whether it would be more beneficial for you to study a singular topic, like let's just say variable scope, until you fully master it, or it would be better for you to spend some time with variable scope and kind of get a feel for it, and then focus on working with different various data types for a little while. And then maybe you go and you answer a few practice problems, and then you kind of come back and you zoom back in on that variable scope thing again. The research on interleaving seems to show that that second sort of like mixed approach is probably going to be more beneficial for you in the long run. And then finally, we have taking breaks, which I think this one is pretty straightforward. Shockingly, there are a ton of studies that I could have pulled for here, but I chose this one mostly because I liked this particular quote from the conclusion here. Quote, our results support the idea that wakeful rest plays just as important a role as practice in learning a new skill. It appears to be the period where our brains compress and consolidate memories of what we just practiced. I want you to think about that phrasing. Just as important. The rest is as important as the actual studying or the practice. I think that sums things up really nicely. Okay, so we know that we want to practice our studying over multiple sessions, and that during like all or most of those sessions, we likely want to study multiple different concepts, both so that we can benefit from the interleaving effect, but also so that we can increase our number of exposures to a specific concept throughout the weeks and the months. And then we also know that we don't need to be a hero and like grind ourselves down. Regular breaks are just as important as the actual studying and practicing that we're doing. So those cover our main organizational concerns. And that's a great start, but we still need to know which specific tactics are the most beneficial to use during these study sessions. And what you see here on the screen is just a summary of the results from like an absolutely massive research review looking at exactly this topic. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about them. You don't actually have to be able to read all of that. But essentially what these researchers did was take 10 really popular study and learning tactics, and they dug heavily into the research on each one of them. And then they assigned their own utility rating to each one based on their assessment of that technique's general effectiveness. Now, that said, this was a massive article. I think it was like 50, 60 pages, something like that. And the authors did a really great job providing caveats and explanations for each of these utility ratings that I think are really relevant for us if we're going to apply this information in our own studies. And I didn't want to leave out all of that context and these sorts of like caveats and just come at you and say, these ones are useful and these ones aren't, right? I didn't think that would be an honest representation of the research. And so what I've done here is create a handful of slides that outline each of the 10 techniques, provides the researcher's utility rating, but then also includes some of the information from the article that I think may be particularly relevant to us as a group, okay? So let's just go ahead and look through these. We're going to start with the high utility study techniques. Number one, I think they're based off of their what they said, the highest utility study technique was practice testing. So practice testing essentially involves answering questions, performing learned tasks, or actively recalling information. So that's flashcards, quizzes, study guides, practice problems, etc. They lumped all of that under this umbrella term of practice testing. And importantly, they did note that there doesn't seem to be one best approach to practice testing. They said all of these things seem to work really well. A quiz, answering questions on a study guide, doing practice problems, all of that stuff, really valuable. And they said active recall appears to be the key here. So that's the sort of unifying characteristic that sort of like, what does, practicing with flashcards have to do with taking a quiz or doing practice problems? Well, you have to actively recall the information. And so that appears to be the key and why practice testing is so important. These techniques outperform nearly every other type of study technique that they looked at. So if you got one takeaway, active recall seems to be the thing. Super, super important. Okay, the other high utility study technique was distributed practice, which we already covered that. That just means like you don't do one big lump of practice, you do smaller lumps, over a longer time frame. And they said that's super useful, super beneficial. Okay. Those are the high utility ones. You got two of them. Let's move into the kind of the moderate utility study techniques. Okay, interleaved practice. Go figure. We already covered all that, so great. We're ahead of the curve here. I did find this kind of interesting, is that it appears to reduce practice performance while dramatically improving test performance. So what they're talking about here is that like during your study sessions, if you're sort of, okay, I'm going to learn about variable scope, and then I'm going to only answer questions about variable scope. You do better than if you're like, I'm going to learn about variable scope and about different data types and about what kind of methods I can call on a hash. And then you try to do practice problems about those. You actually do worse than you would if you chunked it up. But then later, when you're tested on all of those topics in an actual test setting, you actually perform much better on that test. So that's kind of a useful piece of information if you find like, man, if I just say this is my variable scope study block right now, this session, that's the only thing I'm going to learn about, I feel like I do way better on those practice problems. And that's probably true, but that might not carry over to the test. And the research actually indicates that it won't. And the other thing was that they only said that this wasn't really high utility due to there being relatively few studies. So it's not that they said, it's not as useful as this other stuff. They just said, we can't be as confident in the usefulness because the total volume of research is less. Elaborative interrogation was another moderate utility study technique. I thought that was cool because I had actually never heard of this. But essentially, elaborative interrogation just means asking a learner to provide an explanation of an explicitly stated fact. Okay, and doing that appears to help learners remember that fact. And so here was sort of the example that they gave in one of these studies on elaborative interrogation. They basically had two groups of kids, and I think it was 10-year-olds or something. And they would tell the same story. And the story would be, okay, so this man, Jim, went to the grocery store. And then he went to the park to meet his friend, Susan. And they played on the swings, and then Jim went home. Story is something like that, right? So they tell one group, the control group, they tell them, that's how they tell them the story. Jim, grocery store, Susan, park, swings, go home. The other group, they tell them the same story, but they tell them like this. This man, Jim, went to the grocery store. Why do you think he went to the grocery store? And the kid would sit and they'd go, oh, he probably needed to buy some food or something. Maybe he was hungry. And they go, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And then Jim went to the grocery store, or then Jim went to the playground. What do you think he was going to do there? And they're like, oh, he probably wanted to play on something. Yeah, yeah. And he met his friend Susan. How do you think he met Susan? The kid goes, I don't know. Maybe he works with Susan or something, or maybe they went to school together. Oh, okay, great. And they played on the swings. Why do you think they picked the swings? Well, it's probably his favorite thing to play on. Great. Okay. A couple of weeks later, they come back, they call these kids in and they say, hey, remember that story I told you about that guy? What was his name? Where'd he go? Who did he meet? And the kids who had to explain all of those facts, come up with their own explanations for them, remembered the facts way better than the kids who were just told the story. It's kind of a cool effect. And for unclear reasons, I thought this was kind of interesting. This appears way more effective for learners with what they call low domain knowledge. So I get like beginners in a topic. And they called it moderate utility, largely for the same reason as the interleaved practice. The effect size is actually very large, but again, the total volume of research is not the same, unlike the practice testing and stuff like that. And so I found this kind of interesting because it would not be that hard to apply this to your studying here at launch school. Like imagine that you're reading about variable scope. I know I keep talking about that, but you see that you can't access a variable inside of a method body or something like that. You can kind of think to yourself, well, why? Why would I not be able to do that? What would be the reason for that being the case in this language? And even if you don't know the answer, or if you come up with the wrong answer, it actually seems to help you remember that rule or that fact that you actually can't access that variable. It's kind of cool. Okay, so self-explanation was another one, kind of similar to elaborative interrogation in a sense, but essentially learners are asked to explain how they're going to solve a task before solving it. And what this does is it actually improves that person's performance on subsequent similar tasks. They're going to do a puzzle, and instead of just sitting down and trying to do it, you say, hey, how are you going to solve this puzzle? And they have to think through it and tell you, and then they do it. You give them another puzzle. That group who had to explain things does way better on that second puzzle. I found this really interesting because it's literally what happens during some of our coding interview assessments. So it's pretty important. We're going to ask you, like, how are you going to solve this problem? You're going to have to talk through your thought process and your algorithm and then solve it. And so it might be useful to develop that skill in and of itself. And that actually helps you learn and will make you better at solving that type of coding problem. Again, this one, they said super high effect size, it works, but there was a ton of variability in study design. So they weren't comfortable saying in general, this is high utility because, some of the studies were looking at like basketball free throws, and some of them were like learning a song on a guitar, and some of them were like remembering facts about history and stuff. And so like they said, we can't say this works all the time. There's too much variability. There's too much noise in this data, but the effect size does seem to be high. Okay, now on to our low utility study techniques. Okay, summarization, number one here. Basically, they read material and then they summarize it in your own words. We know what summarization was. I tell you what, I was caught off guard because I used that heavily. But here is the caveat that I found really relevant. It does appear effective in learners who are good at summarizing, so meaningfully, not children. children are really bad at summarizing things. So asking them to read something and then summarize it in their own words, they don't have that skill yet. And so that's not a useful thing for them to do. But I don't know if we have any students who are children at launch school. I can't fathom that. Kudos to you if you are, and maybe don't try summarizing. But for adults, if you're good at summarizing, it might still be useful. They did say this, though, it's less effective with very long text. So for us, we maybe don't try to summarize the entire course or even an entire lesson, maybe smaller chunks, maybe an assignment or even a part of an assignment might be more beneficial. Highlighting and underlining, they basically said here, like, this shows very little utility to most learners at all. Like, it doesn't really seem to help. The caveat being may have some benefit when texts are really long and really complex. And so if you think about that, okay, maybe your first pass through like this long lesson or something like that, you do some highlighting and some underlining, or you note things that are particularly useful. But then that's not the end of your studying, really. That's just the beginning, because it doesn't actually seem to help all that much. Keyword mnemonics, not very helpful. That's where you create associations between keywords and images or phrases. So, the planets, like my very educated mother just baked us 9 pies. There's no pies anymore because Pluto's not a planet, but whatever, mnemonic. They might be useful when learners are provided with a mnemonic, so given to them by somebody, like that one I was able to recite, but way less useful when the learner actually have to create the mnemonic themselves. And so I don't think there are really any mnemonic devices given to you in launch school that I can remember. And so don't spend a bunch of time trying to come up with your own, because it doesn't seem to work very well. Interestingly, this may reduce performance on timed tasks or time tests due to delayed recall, like interviews and tests here at launch school are all timed. And so I found that kind of interesting because the reason for that is that you have another layer of processing to get through to get to the end information. So like for me, like I just had to remember I have to remember the mnemonic, and then I have to go through and decode it instead of just remembering Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, whatever the rest of them are. So kind of interesting. There's more low utility study techniques. Using imagery for text-based learning. So that's where you kind of produce a pictorial representation of the material you've just read. It appears highly effective for some specific tasks. Like the example they gave is reading about the structure of an atom. It helps if you then go draw that. But they rated it low utility largely due to being constrained to specific types of material that lend themselves naturally to being represented visually, like the structure of an atom. And so I think the takeaway here is that, like, if you have an intuition that an idea web or some sort of visual pictorial representation can help you learn this material, like maybe we're talking about database design or something like that. I mean, you get there and you could kind of draw how things are connected. That's actually in the course. That might be a fine tool to use, but don't just because you heard somewhere that an idea web or doing some kind of imagery based or pictorial based learning is useful, don't try to shoehorn that into certain topics into that. It tends not to be actually beneficial. It's just kind of a waste of time. Okay, rereading, really, really low on the utility rating. Rereading is what it sounds like. You read a thing more than once. They did note that spaced rereading is likely better than blocked rereading. So if I give you a text of 10 pages and I say, hey, read this twice through, not super helpful. But if I say, hey, read this, a couple hours later, I say, read it again, that actually is helpful. They called it low utility due to the diminishing returns and what they perceive to be a relatively high time commitment and low efficiency. And so there's actually this little chart here, which I found really useful. I hope you can kind of make that out. But essentially, we have horizontally, we have the number of readings. Vertically, we have the percentage of correct response on a test. And so first bar, 0. You don't read a thing, and then I test you on it. Turns out you don't do very well. Go figure. You read it once, you do a lot better. That makes sense. What I found interesting is that jump from 1 to 2 is still a relatively large increase, in my opinion, in correct answers. So something like a 10 or 15% improvement just from reading it again, which to me is pretty good. 15% better on a test. That's the difference between passing and not. But then that jump from 2 to 4 produces very, very little marginal utility or marginal increase in the correct responses. And so maybe the takeaway here is that like definitely once, probably twice. Beyond that, maybe not. Maybe twice is enough for most people. Okay. So that was a ton of information. It was a lot to digest, I'm sure. So I'm going to let that sit there. And what I want to do right now is leave it there. I promise we're going to come back and we're going to kind of talk about some of this stuff at the end when I try to summarize all of this and just wrap up a little bit here. But for right now, what I want to do is just abruptly change topics and present you with this kind of cool protocol for improving studying that I came across when I was creating this webinar. This protocol comes directly from a talk given by Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is a researcher and professor of neuroscience at Stanford University. Incidentally, when I created this, I found this thing. He had a podcast, but it wasn't the mammoth it is right now. So I'm sure everybody knows who, or most people probably know who Dr. Andrew Huberman is now. At the time that I created this, he was just a guy on the internet talking about brains. So he also hosts this really popular podcast. I just said that. So essentially what this protocol is his attempt to synthesize the last 50 years of neuroscience research into a list of actionable steps you can take to sort of maximize your time investment when it comes to studying. And he refers to this as the Neuroplasticity Super Protocol, which I think is sort of a silly name, but that's what he calls it, so whatever. For our purposes, we can think about that word neuroplasticity as referring to the brain and the rest of the nervous system's ability to actually change and physically reshape itself in response to intrinsic and extrinsic stimuli. So in other words, your brain has the capacity to physically change in response to inputs and behaviors. And as far as we know right now, like the ability to do that is pretty much central to all learning and memory creation. And so since I found this protocol, I've been playing with it a little bit and trying to integrate it into my own studies. And as it was presented, I don't think it perfectly maps onto the structure of launch school because it was presented to a bunch of college lecturers and educators and stuff. And so it doesn't perfectly match like sort of a self-paced, self-directed learning style. And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and added some addenda to some of the steps to show how I've integrated them into studying here at launch school. And so when you see something in red on the slide, just know that those are my personal notes and my personal words, not Dr. Andrew Huberman's. I don't want to misrepresent anything. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. I think we have like 9 steps here, if I remember correctly. Okay, so step number 1 is to get alert. Physiological alertness involves the release of epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, in the brain and the body. And one way to achieve this is with 25 to 30 deep breaths, followed by an exhaled breath hold, followed by an inhaled breath hold. So that's the technique that he presented in this talk that he gave. I've also utilized cold showers, brief exercise, and in a pinch, a bunch of coffee. If the goal is really just to release epinephrine and adrenaline, like and some of these catecholamines that affect the brain and the nervous system, there's a lot of ways you can do that. And so subjectively, when I do all of these things, they all seem to work in sort of a similar way. Okay, number 2, get focused. There's a quote from the talk, mental focus follows visual focus. I found that interesting. So focus your attention on a single spot on the wall for 30 to 60 uninterrupted seconds before beginning your studying. Sounds odd. It looks a little odd because you're staring at a wall. But I tell you what, if you don't have a serious background in meditation or mindfulness, like 60 uninterrupted seconds of focusing on an empty spot on the wall is a little bit more challenging. It's a longer 60 seconds than you might be thinking. So does it actually help you get focused on the task at hand? I don't know. For non-sighted individuals, I don't know if we have any here on the talk today. I did experiment with like listening to a single note for 30 to 60 seconds and just focusing on that note. It is subjectively similar, so potentially that's useful as well. Okay, step number 3, generate repetitions. A repetition is going to vary depending on the task at hand, but the goal is to work slightly faster than is comfortable in order to maximize the number of exposures to the learning task. So for us, this works really well for the practice problems. It can also work really well with answering questions on the study guide. And so what I would actually do is I would just say, okay, for this chunk of practice problems I'm going to do, I'm going to try to answer them 15% faster than would be comfortable for me. And what I found is I would make more errors in a sense, but it was kind of this nice practice. And of course, at the end of that study block, I completed more practice problems than I would otherwise. Number 4, expect and embrace errors. Errors improve alertness, which subsequently improve learning. Some research suggests an error rate of roughly 15% is optimal, but don't worry about the specifics too much. And so our key takeaway here is that some errors appears to be better than no errors. I actually found that really interesting and really inspiring because it can be really tough to get stuff wrong or to not remember stuff if you're trying to actively recall it. Well, it turns out actually that might be better. It's making you more alert and actually improving your learning outcomes. It's kind of cool. Number 5, insert micro rest intervals at random. From the talk, during breaks, neurons in the hippocampus and the cortex engage in the same pattern of activity as they were during the learning bout, except about 10 times faster. So it's doing the same thing you were just doing, but faster. Kind of cool. So he's big on random breaks. I tried to do the whole random break thing, and it was completely disastrous and anxiety provoking. Basically, what I did is I put this like random alarm on my laptop where it would just like at random time intervals go off, and then I would rest. And what I found was I just spent the whole time worrying, when is my alarm going to go off? When do I get my break? It was super distracting. I never got used to it. It was horrible. So now what I do is I stick to my scheduled breaks, but sometimes I'll skip them to introduce an element of randomness. And so like I won't decide beforehand. My 25-minute, my little Pomodoro thing is off. My alarm goes off. And in that moment, I will try to randomly decide, do I just go right into the next one or do I take a break? Does that actually help? I'm not sure, but it does introduce this sort of like interesting component there. Number 6, use random intermittent rewards. Rewards improve motivation and goal-oriented behavior. This is extra true for random intermittent rewards, i.e. casinos. Anybody who's listened to the Huberman Lab podcast knows the man loves to talk about dopamine and the dopaminergic system. And you want to talk about spiking dopamine, boy, random intermittent rewards are a sure way to do it. That's why people get addicted to things like gambling. And so I did find that random rewards are hard to self-administer. You know, an example he would give gave in his talk was you maybe provide like a food reward or something to your students if you're a lecturer. Hard to do that for yourself. But what I do is on some of my breaks, I now try to do a rewarding task, like checking my email. I know it doesn't sound rewarding, but it feels that way. Other times I will literally do the least rewarding thing I can, which is staring at a wall. And so I try to make some of them randomly really rewarding. I'll go eat a banana or something I like. And then other times not rewarding at all to kind of introduce this sort of like, oh, banana, a little dopamine surge. Okay, on to the next one. Number 7, limit learning sessions to 90 minutes. Solid research shows that 90 minutes is about the maximum that you can maintain focus and efforts towards learning. Shorter sessions, totally fine. Longer, perhaps not. Interestingly, he did mention that like 270 minutes may be close to a daily maximum. I found this particularly useful or interesting, not really useful, but because I do the Pomodoro thing. And so that's about 100 minutes with a couple little breaks in there. And then I would do, 2 to 3 a day. So 200 to 300 minutes. I'm pretty close in that maximum. So I was like, oh, that certainly, aligns with my personal experience. Number 8, after a learning session, do a non-sleep deep rest session. NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, includes brief naps, yoga nidra, or self-hypnosis. Those last two might seem kind of wackadoo, depending on your perspective. I promise they're not. Like yoga nidra is more of like a meditation, and so is self-hypnosis. There's actually quite a bit of clinical research on self-hypnosis being beneficial as a form of non-sleep deep rest. So you can look both of those things up on like YouTube and get a ton of free kind of videos and walkthroughs on how to do either of those if you're interested. And decades of research shows that following a study or a practice bout with this type of activity improves learning and retention. And it's likely most beneficial within an hour of the learning bout. So don't go, okay, I'm going to do all of my learning. I'm going to go hang out, go to the gym, whatever. And then I'll do my yoga nidra at the end of my day. Probably not beneficial in the same way of like just following that learning bout with a little bit of non-sleep deep rest. Charles says, what actually happens? if you do this like deep rest session after a learning session. So what we talked about with the activity in the hippocampus and the cortex, you get those same effects. That happens during like breaks and happens during sleep. It actually happens a lot during these non-sleep deep rest sessions. And so you can get sort of that like memory or learning consolidation happening in the brain with this short little non-sleep deep rest session. And it improves like people in the clinical research where they're like, okay, we administer this after a practice or a learning session, or we don't. Well, the people who get it have better retention and learning when they're tested later. Okay. And then finally, I think, get quality and sufficiently long deep sleep. The actual rewiring of neural circuits that underlies learning occurs during sleep and non-sleep deep rest, like I just told Charles there who asked. And performing the study session means that we might learn, but in many ways, the actual learning occurs during sleep. I really like that framing. Like you're potentiating learning, you're potentiating improvement by doing the practice and by doing the studying, but you really don't get it unless you get that sleep and the rest. I think that's really a useful reframing. Dr. Huberman's recommendation was to aim to get good sleep at least 80% of the time. So I don't know how useful that is, but that was his recommendation. I think like the big takeaway here is that like, if you find yourself spending a lot of time studying, but your sleep is really, really terrible, you're only getting 5 or 6 hours, you're groggy all the time, you're probably not getting the benefits that you could and you should be out of your studying. And so instead of doing more studying, it might be better for you to focus on that sleep component and improve that. Okay. All right, so ton of information. Honestly, it's kind of overwhelming. We're in our last couple minutes here. Uh, I do also just want to clarify, because I just talked about neuroscience and stuff. I am by no means an expert in this field, in cognitive science, learning, neuroscience. Uh, Side note, my wife is actually a practicing neuroscientist, and she laughs that I give this talk. I'm just a guy who spent a lot of time looking at this research and thinking about all this stuff. Okay, so there's my caveat. And in doing so, I've noticed that some trends, and I think I can try to draw some conclusions about what actually seems to matter when it comes to studying and learning. Again, from my perspective, a layman's perspective. So I don't think this is a comprehensive list, but I do hope you might find it useful. So I just called this list things that are probably true to kind of hedge my bets here. Okay, first thing that's probably true. Repetition, particularly spaced repetition of concepts and topics, is pretty much mandatory. Like, I think the good news here is that if you read something once or twice and you don't understand it, that's normal, totally normal. It's healthy, it's expected. Learning is almost always going to be this iterative process where you go over things multiple times and look at them from different perspectives. And if you allow that process to unfold naturally rather than getting frustrated and thinking like, well, I should already know this because I read it once, or I shouldn't have to study this a second or a third time. It turns out that you'll probably end up learning a lot more thoroughly and effective if you just let that sort of spaced repetition be a natural part of how you do things. Number two, this is a related point, but mixing it up is probably a good idea. So don't feel like you need to bear down and focus on one topic until you fully learn it before you can move on. Interleaving your studies by looking at different concepts in the same study session is probably a good idea. Additionally, within the context of launch school, like assessments block things off anyways. So you don't need to build additional roadblocks for yourself by like fully mastering one concept before you allow yourself to move on to the next. Allow the natural roadblocks of the assessments to kind of serve as your constraints. Number three, breaks, sleep, and rest matter just as much. That's the quote from that study, just as much as the actual work that you're doing. So take those things seriously. Number four, there probably aren't any mandatory study techniques. Doesn't seem like it anyways. Even that one research study that applied utility ratings to the various techniques was full of caveats and exceptions all over the place. They would say like this technique worked for some people in some concepts when they're studying some topics. And so you should probably feel to experiment and find what actually does work for you. Number five, there's probably a soft limit on how long or how much you're able to actually learn in a day. Or at least there are like significantly diminishing returns after a certain point. So that means if you're studying part-time and you're bummed out that you can't dedicate like 10 hours a day to your studies, I don't know, like it's okay. That ninth and that 10th hour probably wouldn't make a difference anyway. So don't be super bummed about it. Number 6, focus and attention matter a whole lot. So do what you need to do to avoid like distractions, get alert for your study sessions, and focus on the work that you're actually doing. Whether that means using a time management technique like I did, doing some breathing exercises like Dr. Huberman recommends, doing some meditation, or it just means like turning your phone off and going for a walk when you feel your mind watering. Like all of that stuff seems to help. Okay. And then finally, number 7, errors and struggling are good. Like if you're bummed out because you're not nailing every single practice problem, or you have to really work hard to understand some concepts, that's okay. It's totally okay. In fact, you're probably learning more than you would if it all came super easily to you. Okay, so last slide, I promise. If this workshop has you like super jazzed up and excited to try some of these study techniques, I encourage you to experiment with a few different approaches as you kind of work through the core curriculum. And if you're still in prep and you're on the fence about core because you're worried about your ability to actually learn the material, I would like to invite you to check out a few of the studying related resources we have for students here at Launch School. First, we have these live TA-led study sessions. These are mostly geared towards students in the core curriculum, but there are a few of them open to prep students. If you want to check them out, you can head over to the community forum page on the Launch School website, where you can see announcements about all of the upcoming study groups. That's launchschool.com/events. Next, we have our Launch School GatherTown space, which is an interactive virtual study space where you can collaborate with other students or just kind of access some helpful study tools. Like we have coder pads and whiteboards in there. It's actually pretty cool. It's like you get like an 8-bit little video game character. You get to walk around and talk to people. And it's open to everybody, including prep students. So I encourage you to check that out if that sounds at all tempting to you. And then finally, we have Slack, which is a great place for you to ask questions about any topics that you might be finding particularly difficult or anything where you're just sort of getting stuck. Okay. If you're already in the core curriculum, I hope you're taking advantage of these resources. And if you're still in prep, I do encourage you to check them out because they're a great way to help your studying be more fun and social and interactive. And then, of course, if you feel ready to sign up for core, I would encourage you to do that. Okay. Do we have any questions or comments? I have going to open up the floor for anybody who has any questions about anything I said or anything sort of in this general realm here. Okay, we have a question. Oh, Anonymous says, I wonder if you could click through the first few slides once more. They had to call in originally. Sure, I can do that. Josh says, when do you find collaborating or studying with others useful for you personally, e.g. studying with others before taking an assessment? Great. So let me go ahead and kind of click back through here. Anonymous, sorry, everybody, this went dizzying. Don't look at the screen. It's a lot of words on these slides. Anonymous, I'm going to go back to just like the beginning, and you tell me how far to go here. There you go. Here's the first one. Josh, Josh wants to know, when do I find collaborating or studying with others useful for me personally? Yeah. I'm a little bit of a loner. That might be overstating it a little bit, but I don't find it particularly beneficial, with one exception for me personally. I know other students who would say, oh man, that's the best thing to do, the study groups and stuff. For me personally, I study pretty well on my own. With the one exception is that, well, okay, I'll give you two exceptions. The one exception, biggest exception, is the technical interview. Okay, where you actually have to code in front of another person and talk to them about what you're doing and how you're going to solve the problem and all that type of stuff. That's a totally different world than doing it on your own. Having that audience, having the audience there, kind of watching you and assessing you, totally different thing. So I strongly recommend, before you get to that first, like the 119 interview, you practice doing that, coding in front of somebody else. It's not the same as coding on your own. The other thing, or the other time it might be useful, and I've done it a few times, is when I found a topic particularly tricky I would challenge myself to be able to explain it to somebody else. I find that that is sort of like the peak of the mountain with understanding, is that if you could take something that was confusing to you and that you didn't get and learn it well enough that you could then teach it to somebody, that is a really great way to learn that tough topic. And so those are the two times that I personally would do sort of anything collaborative or social. But that varies, and, that's a ton of individual variation there. I know some people really, they'll go into Slack and they'll like get a group of students who are all sort of doing roughly the same, they're in the same part of the curriculum as them, and they like study together. They just meet at certain times and turn on Zoom and study and hang out. Some people really like that and find it beneficial. So, yeah, we got anybody else? No. Okay, nobody has any questions. That's fantastic. Well, everybody, before you take off, I appreciate y'all sticking around. I did forget to send this over. We do have that feedback form, which I'm going to post in the chat right now. So there's a little link there. If you go ahead and you fill out the form there, it's going to take you like 2 or 3 minutes, and it's going to give me some information about how I did today and what I could have done better. So if you do that for me, I appreciate it. Otherwise, everybody have a great night or a great afternoon or a great morning or whatever time it is in your part of the world. And I hope I see y'all sometime soon.